Hello everyone, welcome. We're on, yes, we are streaming. And then everyone left. Okay, great. Nice to see you, but better luck next time. But we are on, everything is, I hope, working nicely. And we are continuing with lecture number 2 in this project management course. Project 2, which still is web technologies. And for those of you who couldn't attend the first lecture, which was the introduction, we were basically talking about the project itself, a web shop that you're going to create. And you are going to use Angular and Firebase in order to do that. But in order to actually understand how to use Angular and Firebase, we need to look a little bit into the core web technologies that are available. So, for example, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Yesterday, we managed to get through HTML and large parts of CSS, or CSS2 at least. And today, we are going to go in deeper into CSS3 and also have a look at JavaScript and so on. Great. Let's continue then. As I said last time, CSS3 is something that has been ongoing for quite some time, and it is still not finished, so to say. There are, however, large number of already up and running parts of CSS3, and you can use loads of CSS3. And again, you can check this caniuse.com for specific elements or rules in CSS3 to see if they are possible to use or not. Another big difference in contrast to CSS2 is that CSS3 is modular instead of being one monolith. And that means that it contains a number of modules, about 40 or so, and they are independently developed, making it possible to have some parts of the standard fully working, while others are not fully working yet. And the idea of CSS3 is actually to make many of the things that previously needed JavaScript or even Flash much easier to do in a standardized way. So we are going to look at a number of things that previously were done using JavaScript and or Flash. And I'm fully aware that there are a multitude of things that you can do with JavaScript libraries like Animate, for example. But we are going to look at the fundamental parts in this lecture so that you can understand how the different things in other libraries work later on. Yeah, let's move on. One thing that I want to point out right now is that you will see a number of different slides where we use so-called vendor-specific prefixes. And at the beginning of CSS3 development, they decided to add what's called these vendor prefixes, saying that in order to test this thing that's not perhaps fully implemented in the standard yet, but it's implemented in WebKit or Mozilla or Opera browsers and so on, we can add these prefixes to the rule and make it work for that specific web browser or CSS engine. And I still have loads of these here. Most of the time, the things that I'm going to show you will work nicely without these prefixes today. Also, they've decided that even though this was a good idea in the beginning with prefixes, it has meant quite a lot of problems later on because these prefixes were only really meant to work with experimental features. but people left them on, enabled in production as well, meaning that different behavior worked even though it really shouldn't, and so on. So more and more we try to move away from these prefixes, even though I'd say that the idea behind the prefixes is a good idea, because it makes possible for us to test things that aren't really working yet. And the motivation was that otherwise we will see a lot of JavaScript code that checks for, is this an Internet Explorer 7, then use this. Is this Chrome, use this. Is this Chrome version, use this, and so on. And we had quite a lot of these things when the web was much younger than it is today. Checks for different kinds of browsers and doing different things depending on which browser it is. They've tried to move away from the vendor prefixes into smaller modules, smaller things that are going to work, and also adding developer prefixes instead, and so on. However, as I said, I still have these vendor prefixes, so you can see them in these slides. But the stuff that I'm going to show you is probably going to work right out of the box right now. But caniuseit.com is your friend. Check if it works. If it does, use it. If it doesn't work with most browsers, and with most browsers I mean Chrome, Mozilla, Edge, and Safari. But the more browsers that actually work with a specific rule, the better, of course. So check it up. What we have and what we're going to look at today are layouts, transitions, transformations, and web fonts. And they will probably work right out of the box for all the major browsers out there. The one browser that's still problematic is Internet Explorer 11, but that one can be seen as so old now that hopefully no one will use it. Also, I'm fully aware that there are these polyfill libraries and so on that you can use to get most browsers up to a standardized level, but we will try to work with these as they work with the standard browsers. And if we begin with layout, I told you last time that the ancient way of doing layouts is to use tables, and you're not allowed to do that because of your children and all of that. However, after that we got all of these div tags, and the standardized way of doing layouts in CSS2 is to use div tags and put margins and padding and so on onto these div tags. And that works perfectly well today as well. And you'll find a multitude of examples of really nicely layout web pages using div tags today out in the web, on the web, I should say. And I should also say that for your project, you are of course welcome to look at different layouts that you find at the Zen Garden or whatever it might be, and borrow stuff when you're allowed to borrow stuff. The idea is that getting everything to work together might be more problematic than you think at first sight. So for a long time, div tags was the way that we made layouts in HTML or in CSS2. With CSS3, we have now two additional ways of doing it. One of them is Flexbox, the other one is Grid, and I will show you an example of both of these. And Flexbox is just that, flexible boxes. It's one of the most flexible ways of creating layouts. However, from time to time it can be a bit too complex. And I believe that's one of the reasons why we have the grid layout as well. And you're welcome to use any and all of them, of course. The idea here is that Flexbox works by having a container, and this container will contain different items. We use div tags to define the different items and the different containers. But we can do that in a much more flexible way. So flexible layouts that are horizontal and vertical, and so on. All major browsers today work with this. As I said previously, Internet Explorer 11 does not. And at top level, we have the container rules, and we use display flex in order to have a flexible or a flex box layout. We define a number of rules for this layout with direction, if we want to have wrapping, if we want to justify content, how to align the different items, so the contents, and so on. And there are shorthands, flow flex, for example, for the most well-known. The children are also given a number of rules, like order, so in which order they are going to be shown on the web page. And this is really nice to just be able to change this order to put something on the other side and so on. If they are going to grow or shrink and so on, and the base is the default size of an item and so on. I think you get the point here. And just to show you a first simple example, we have a container. We can call this whatever we like, but I call it container. It's of display type flex. It has a line item center and justify content center, a height and a border to define the space that this container has. And the flex item has a max width of 50%, so it will be half of what we think. And then we just use it, div class container over here, and here we have flex item like this, and we get something like this. I am in the middle. Yeah, that's nice. We like. But now for something a bit larger, an example of a 3-column design layout, where we in HTML say that we have a div class container which has nav, which will be one of our div classes, one of our classes. We have main and we have aside, and they will be 3 columns. In CSS, we say that the container has flex. We are using row, so they will be in a row. Nav will have a minimum width of 300 pixels, and it will not grow. Main, however, will grow, have some padding, and have a width of 20 EM, which is a measure. And the aside has a maximum width, a minimum width, but will not grow. And what we get when running this is something like this. A promo of the new Star Wars movie, May 25. Everyone's going. I rephrase my question. Everyone wants a grade in this course? Great, see you there on the 25th. The idea here is that we have something to the left, we have something in the middle, and we have something over there to right as well. Oh, sorry. This always happens when you stream. So this was Flexbox. However, as it tends to be fairly complex after a while, there is actually an alternative right now called the grid layout, which was just recently out of experimental. But we now have support in most browsers for grid as well. And it actually looks back at how we did layouts in the really old days with tables, and gives us the ability again to create a more flexible layout than the tables did, but with the same way of thinking, namely to create a grid with different parts being different items. So this means that defining something that we did before with 3 columns is quite easy using grid layout. We use display grid as the way of doing it, and then we can define the number of rows and columns and the gap between them and so on. We can use a grid template for doing this, or we can use rows and columns. The only thing that's strange is that we start with 1 instead of 0 when we count rows and columns. And that's really strange. So we have a container again. We have display grid. We set all of the different row cells to automatic, so it will take the text that's inside. We have a grid gap of 10 pixels, and we have a grid column number like this, so it just tells in what order the different things will be put. And again, here is a promo of the next Star Wars movie, which I presume everyone will attend on May 25th. Yes is the right answer. Great. But we see we get exactly the same layout, but with less code, making it fairly easy for us to choose the best way. So Flexbox will give you much more flexibility. It will allow you to create a really complex layout. You can create much more complex layouts than this with grid as well. But just to get things up and running, I'd say that grid layout is a lot easier to use. But you can use anything but tables. Moving on, we are going to look at what's called transitions as well. And a lot of the things that are available in CSS3 is a way of transitioning or transforming, changing things on the web page. So, for example, fading a color well, just let's have a look at fading a color. And this was done with JavaScript and Flash and stuff like that before. However, using this transition, in this case, we want to change for links the background color with this transition rule, which has a number of different alternatives. So transition property, duration, timing function, and we'll see later on that we can actually use a shortcut for all of these. Today you don't need the MOS stuff before for prefix, but I'll show you anyway. The property defines what property to change, and if we look back at the example, it says background here, so we change the background color. Duration defines the time, and timing function is one of the different ways that we are going to do this, like ease, linear, ease, in, out, and so on. So basically, if the fading effect will be instant, if it's going to be fading fast in the beginning and then slower at the end, or the other way around, and so on. Experiment or just use something that you find is cool. As I said, shorthand, transition, background, 0.5, and ease like this. And the reason why we have vendor prefixes is that if we want to make this work for a number of different, like Moz, WebKit, and Opera, we can add the different prefixes like this and still have the one that's the standard way of doing it. And as I said, by now you don't need for transitions all of these, because all of these browsers will support transitions just fine without this. There's a bunch of more stuff that you can do with transitions, like delaying it or after you've done whatever it might be, like hoovering in this case. And all will change everything and so on. And knowing these properties is of course difficult with opacity, position, font size and so on. So have a look at one of many different web pages that will list all the different things that you can do. And as I said, there are numerous of other JavaScripts out there. I just list jQuery, Scriptalicious, but of course Animation.js as well, that can help you do this a lot better. Some of them are better integrated into Angular than others are, but you can actually use almost anything that you like. And the idea here is to have a simple, fast and easy way of doing this instead of using, for example, Flash or using large JavaScript libraries. We're going to show you a short menu, or a short menu, yeah, it's fairly short. A menu which we will add a lot of CSS code to in order to make it look nicer than it does to begin with. And this also shows how a menu is most often created, namely by using an unordered list. And we say that all the different list items will be our menus. If we just use this, we will have a number of list items on top of each other. But we don't want that. We want a horizontal menu instead. So we'll look into how we can do that. And in CSS2, we could already do a lot of things, like removing the underlining for the anchor, remove the bullet sign. So instead of having a little bullet, we have none. Put them side by side by using float and have some margin at that. And we do that, as you can see here, we are doing it directly, whereas here we are doing it first for this specific element, and here we're going to do it for list item, which is inside of the nav, so the child of that one. Then let's add some CSS3. We can change the color. We do that with RGBA, A for alpha, meaning the opacity, and we can set that from 1, completely opaque, to 0, which is fully transparent. And for all anchors inside of list items, we change the color to this, 255, 255, 255, and slightly transparent. And then we can move on using cool effects like text shadow, which takes different parameters and colors. So in this case, we have in the direction in different ways from the original text, and then also the specific color of the shadow. This is what we are going to use. However, if you want to see the effect more clearly, you can add a bit more, a few more pixels in order to make it more visible. We want to do this when we hover over a rule, so therefore we add to the hover rule and to the focus rule background color, which is just a fallback if the browser for some reason doesn't support RGBA, but most of them do today. So we see that the transparency will be just 0.15, or the alpha will be 0.15 instead when we hover the mouse over. And lastly, we put some radius, so they will be like this, rounded corners instead of being just boxes. And a little transition at that. So when we hover over a rule, all of the different properties will, on 0.3 seconds, ease in and out. I'm not showing this in real life now, but if you look closely, there is a slight rounded corner rectangle behind the specific menu item that we are hovering over here, and the others not so, and they have a slight shadow. Actually, it's really good looking, so have a look at that. Or at least it's really good looking for being almost 10 years old by now. And I know that everything is flat and no shadows and stuff like that now, but I like this example because it shows what can be done with both CSS2, but also what we can add with CSS3. And the good thing here is that it will work even though we might be using a web browser that does not use CSS3 or does not implement all of CSS3. So it's harmless to use. And here, just for reference, is the entire CSS file. Okay, so the first thing that we looked at, transition, is to transition a thing, an element on the web page from one state to another. Another thing that we can do is transformation, which means that instead of just changing the state of it, like color, position, and so on, we actually change the object itself. So that could be scaling, skewing, moving, and so on. So the idea is that we have both 2D and 3D transformations. We are going to look at a 2D transformation where when hovering over an image, it will grow, so it will scale. There are 3D transformations as well, and I have previously done one, but I've not included it in this lecture. But it's possible to have, I have a nice image of a Pink Floyd cover, and when hovering it will switch ways like this. Really cool stuff. However, we will just look at 2D transformations in this lecture. And we do that by, again, having a few images here. And these images are in the class gallery, and they are just list items, just as before. And what we need to do first is to put them side by side. We do that with this float, and we'll see too that we have a little bit of space in between them, and a border just to make it nice, and list style none so that we don't have any decoration. And then CSS3 scaling. And we do that with the transform rule, which we say, well, scale this 1.5. And that's actually all that's needed in order to scale an image from being small to being large. And we see that we add this to the hover element or pseudo class. However, let's add a few more things just in order to make it look better, namely transitions. So we have transform. On transition, do the transform that we have defined. On 0.2 seconds ease in and out, meaning that instead of just popping up, it will, during 0.2 seconds, actually grow, making it look a lot better than just popping up large. And we also put a box shadow onto this, which is 4 pixels wide. And this one is also really nice to look at. So when you hover over an image, it will scale 1.5, and we have a slight shadow under there again. Again, Pink Floyd. I told you the names yesterday, so now just repeat them. David Gilmour, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and over there, the ear of Rick Wright. We skipped one. Which one? Oh, you're not paying attention. Sid Barrett. I'm giving you real hardcore stuff that you need to know in life. right then, let's move on to web fonts. And yes.
With all these transformations, is it possible to zoom in an image, or is just like?
Yes, you can have a little bit of zoom in into an image as well. However, all these scales, whether you zoom in or you zoom out, they will just change the size of it. So if you do, the pixels will be larger, so to say, or smaller, depending on which way you go. So the image will not look as good, of course. But yes, it's possible. Okay, fonts or typefaces are really cool stuff that you should be using. And the first attempts of trying to add typefaces to web pages was done with Netscape in '98. However, it has taken some time before we really gotten where we ought to be and where we are today. Today we have this font face or @font face in CSS3, and we can use a typeface that's available on the server itself or on another web page. And as most of you know, you can use web fonts from, for example, Google. Google has a large selection of web fonts that are freely available. Choose a number of them that are good looking, and that can take some time because there are so many ugly fonts out there. And try to have just a few font faces or fonts on a single page. So all the things that are true for publishing is true here as well. So perhaps use one for headings and one for the most of the paragraph text and so on. Try not to go over 3 typefaces unless you have a specific reason for it. It might be image text or something like that. You want another typeface. Other than that, try to use as few of them as possible. But please use something else than the standard ones. And also, I would really encourage you to use web fonts from, for example, Google, but anywhere you like, or to place them on the web server, because you can use different formats. WOF, and I don't know what they smoked, OpenType, TrueType, or even SVG, but don't use that. But you can put these font files onto the server rather than relying on, for example, Georgia or Tomahawk or whatever it might be that's available on specific computers. Because not all computers have all the different typefaces that you might think of. So use the typefaces that are available on the net. Here's an example, and just to make this more interesting, I've added a multiple columns example in this one as well. Yeah, and I've done that inline, which isn't very nice, but I've done that. The rule is called column, and we make a column count 3. So the column count 3 means that by default we will want to have 3 columns in our text. However, if the page is too small, it will not enforce 3 columns, but rather try to make it 1 column or 2 columns. So it will change the number of columns, but the optimal one will be 3. We have some width for the columns, defining when want to change the number of them, a column, and also rule between them. But we will also use add typefaces. So we have a number of these font face elements over here. We say font family Optima regular, which is a WOF file, which I've placed on the server. We also use open type file over here placed on the server. In this example, I haven't used anything from Google, but you'll see later on when we do that. These two, as I said, are placed onto the server. And then I say that the paragraph will use Optima Regular, while H1 will use heading, which is this Gothic Ultra OT thingy. And then it will look like this. Cesatine, you know, the really nice guy from Star Wars. And we see here Optima, which is one of the most good-looking typefaces in my book. And we see that down here we have these 3 columns, and if we change the size of the web page, it will fall down to 2, and it will automatically reformat the text which is inside. Great, looking good. Now we can move on to learning more on CSS3. And again, I've used this font awesome because it's fun. So you will want to know more about not Font Awesome. You can use Font Awesome as a web font, actually. So you can fill your web pages with these ugly thingies as well. But don't. But if you want to know more about CSS, there are a number of ways to do that. Of course, W3 School and Mozilla, as we saw previously, they are great places to learn more about this. We have CSS Tricks, which has loads of information, as well as HTML Dog, which has CSS for beginners. And while we are on this topic, I would like to mention the SAS and LESS libraries as well. Both SAS and LESS are preprocessors for CSS, which add additional functionality to CSS. So, for example, it's possible to create hierarchies. So you define parts and then you add to those parts, to add variables into the CSS and so on, which you can reuse. And that's really, really handy from time to time. So they add functionality. They will, when we run this transpiler, be transpiled to ordinary CSS. But during web development, it's really nice to have these features as well. And later on, when we set up Angular, it's possible to in there add a switch which makes it possible to use SAS or LESS as the default CSS styling. And that makes life a little easier actually when we are trying this out. And it's impossible to talk about CSS and not to mention Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a large library with predefined CSS styling in it. And you've probably seen it from time to time used on different web pages. So the idea there is that you get a lot of predefined things like buttons and also layouts. And the latest version, Bootstrap 4, makes use of Flexbox and makes use of SAS, making it really easy to define web pages that are not only good looking, because most of us, I don't say all of you, but most of us are perhaps not that good at design. No. I have no idea. I cannot, for the life of me, do something that looks good. However, using Bootstrap, saying I want this primary button, wherever it might be, and it looks so good. It looks like I'm actually knowing what I'm doing. However, I'm not. So it's a great help for all of us that don't know red from green, for example. So it has loads of stuff, and it also makes it easy to create layouts which are really responsive so that they work well with other devices, though we do not enforce that onto you. You don't need to create this web shop and make it be fully responsive design. However, if you use Bootstrap or something like that, then it's a lot easier to do that. It also uses JavaScript and jQuery to do this and make it work nicely on most browsers as well, which is a good thing, because then we don't need to think of all of these different vendor prefixes or what works with what web browser and so on. So I wholeheartedly recommend looking at Bootstrap as a way of making your web pages look a lot easier. Now, before moving on, I'd say that a 15-minute break is a good thing. So we take a 15-minute break. Yes. All right. That probably looked very cool streaming. We're back again, and we are going to look at JavaScript. And the first thing I'm going to say about JavaScript is that in this course, we are not going to use it. Yeah. Yeah, great. Because JavaScript is formally, academically, however, we need to know of it. When we get later on into Angular, we will see that it uses TypeScript instead, and that makes life a lot easier. But we need to know about JavaScript, as everything is going to be transpiled into JavaScript anyway. And from the beginning, JavaScript has been a client-side programming language introduced in '95 in Netscape. And the idea is to have a way to manipulate the DOM tree and all the things that are available on the web page, and thereby being able to create interaction on the web page in a meaningful way. It was submitted to the European Computer Manufacturers Association, ECMA, which is a standardization organization, and the official name of JavaScript is ECMAScript from that standardization organization. But no one says ECMAScript anyway, because it's really difficult to say ECMAScript. Latest version, 2017, from June 2017. And there are quite a few JavaScript engines that is the thingy that actually executes these JavaScripts. And it is a general purpose language, so you will find it from time to time in other places as well. For example, I use the GNOME desktop for Linux, and the user interface there uses JavaScript in order to do all its stuff. So it is available outside the web browser, but most commonly inside of it. And as I said, an important friend of JavaScript is the document object model, which is a tree-based view of, or in memory, as I say, representation in a tree way of all the different elements that are available in the web page. So all the different nodes and stuff like that. Yeah. Practically, we use JavaScript today as just as CSS as an external file, which we read. However, we can also use it inline using the script tag like this. And as we'll see later on, when we look at Angular, everything is built up in a completely different way. However, in the end, it will return this in one way or another. We can put the code where we want to execute it, or we can put it in the head. Here's a simple example, or I should just point out that in the good old days, we added these comment tags or common HTML comments to the code as well, because there were a lot of different web browsers that didn't fully execute JavaScript, or it was, as I said yesterday, it was deactivated in the web browser and so on, and we don't want that code just showing. However, today that's not the case, so we can do something like this. We define a script of the type JavaScript, and here we have, in this case, a function called message, which just pops up a hello from JavaScript, and on load of the body, we call this message function. And it will look something like this, depending on the web browser, of course. Hello from JavaScript. Press OK. As most languages, it has a number of statements and expressions. So we can use the, from the do model, we can use the document write to print something onto the page. we've also seen curly brackets and stuff like that. We have variable declarations, but we don't need to put a type, which is, well, I don't use harsh language, but it's really, really stupid in my point of view. So var name rancor var height 10 like this. And because it's weakly typed, we don't know what type this is. They also have this 3 equal signs after each other to check for exactly equal in both value and type. And that's just one of the reasons why I think JavaScript is nah. However, most of these things are actually fixed in TypeScript. So it's based on C syntax, so therefore all the ordinary things like if and for are available. We use var instead of int, but other than that it works exactly the same. So that prints out something on the web page, while this does it 3 times. There's a for-in version as well. So complete function, print something, declare the variables, print them out. Java's rancor was 10 meters. That's tall, and write go 3 times. It was a boring day at the work. More interesting might be the arrays, because the arrays later on we are going to see will become this JavaScript object notation or JSON that we are going to use slightly at least when we get to the Angular part. So the idea is that we can have arrays in different normal ways as well, like this, or we can use them as associative arrays, where we say that we have a brand Volvo, a type V60 cross-country, and then we have the indexes brand and type, for example. And I got this car. It's bronze colored. It's really nice. I like it a lot. Yeah. And we can print it out like this. Yeah. The idea, as I said, is that we are going to look at this JavaScript object notation later on, and then that's actually just an associative array, as we've seen here. I should perhaps point out that the most common way is to use single quotes instead of these double quotes that I've used over here, but both actually work. Events are stuff that can be detected by JavaScript. So when we have things in forms, for example, or as we did the onload previously in the examples, that means that these events can be picked up by the JavaScript, and different things can be done based on that. And that's the general idea of JavaScript or the original idea at least, to have this interactivity by using JavaScript. Onload, on unload, on focus, on blur, on change, on submit for complete forms, checking the mouse and so on. All of this is of course possible to react to from JavaScript. Here's a simple example. We have a button, and the on click will call the show alert over here, which will say bling. No, it won't. It will just pop something like this up. Depending again on which browser you're using, it will look slightly different. I use Firefox for my examples because I have 100 tabs open in Chrome, and I don't want you to see all of them. But I use both of them. I use Edge as well. No, I don't. Just kidding, yeah. All right, functions. We've seen functions just defined in a similar way as we've seen previously, with the keyword function, and then the function name and number of parameters, and then statements. just like we did over here, we can call the show alert or whatever kind of function we want. And we can also have a return statement, but we don't necessarily need to say that we submit anything back. And JavaScript is object-oriented, and before ECMAScript or JavaScript 2016, they primarily used a prototype-based object orientation, which wasn't really like the one that we're used to from, for example, Java, or from C# or C++ or any other object-oriented language. So it's just another model for doing this. But from 2016 and onwards, this has been overhauled, and they've added a layer on top of the existing object orientation, making it look a lot more like normal, so to say, object orientation. So today it's quite possible to use it as a normal object-oriented language. And we'll see in TypeScript later on that they pushed it even further to make it look even more like a regular language, so to say. The idea with JavaScript in the beginning was to make it really fast and easy to make all of this code. So therefore they didn't do much with types and stuff like that, because it's always in the way when you want to do something. However, over time this has switched to there being perhaps everyone sees that there is a need to be more static, more type oriented. There are a number of standard objects or classes to use, like array, boolean, date, and so on. And there's also more coming from the Doom tree and so on. We can create a new object by saying var the date equals to new date, and we can use methods like we are used to. And this is done using the old way. However, there's also a bunch of other ways we can do this, and if we want to create our own objects, we can do that like this. So var person is new object. What kind of object? I have no idea. It's an object. Okay, and we don't need a class defined for this, so we can say that this person that we created, it should have a name. So person.name Anakin, and done. Very fast. However, if you somewhere misspell name and print the Swedish namn instead, then you have two attributes, and so on. Methods used by functions. We're using functions. So this show name is a function which pops up an alert with the name. So objects are nothing more than associative arrays, which is a facade around it all to make it look more like other languages as well. And this is not the new object orientation. This is the old one that they've got. And therefore we can see things like this. So we say where we had name, Anakin, say loud, which is a function, and say loudly calls a function somewhere else. But we see and we understand the looks of this as JSON. And JSON is something that's been used quite a lot recently, as it is quite a lot easier way of handling data over the internet than XML, for example, which has more or less just pushed away. The new object orientation means that we can do things like this instead. Namely, we have something called a class, which declares a class, in this case Jedi. It has a start and end. It has a constructor, and the constructor in JavaScript is called constructor, so that no one makes something wrong. So, and it can take a parameter, we can set it, we can have a method like this, salute will return may the force be with you, this name. So it looks a lot like object orientation that we are used to. And this is what we are going to, more or less at least, with some added sugar, use in TypeScript as well. Yeah, may the force be with you, Ray. Hey, hey. As I said, the document object model is something that's really important when it comes to understanding what we want to do with JavaScript, because up until now it's been just a ordinary programming language and one with a few defects, if I may say so. But we do have a real need for it when it comes to interacting with the different elements that are available on the web page. So for example, if we have a form, we can use this document object and look at the form and see how many objects or elements are available in this form. So we can check this and we can get to specific parts. In this case, we want the field value to uppercase, so we can do things with the different elements. And I'll show you a short example of how this can be done. We have a number of different properties like inner HTML, node name, node value, and so on. And some important methods like get element by ID or tag name, making it possible for us to reach for a specific element that's available in the DOM tree. And we can do things with the text value that's inside. And that's actually what we're going to do with the coming example. Here we have a example where Kedbane and Duro over here are span tags which we just pick out. And we do that by, in this script or in this HTML, we begin by setting two span tags to name and planet, Kedbane and Duro like this. And that means that we can create a variable in JavaScript that looks at the document and gets the element by ID name and by ID planet, and then just prints it out with this right. So the name was plus the name dot inner HTML. And then it prints, as you saw, the name first and then the planet. So by using get element by ID and using inner HTML, we can get the values. And it is, of course, possible to do this the other way around, namely to have the same text as we had before, but instead we have this change text, which will be activated when we press a button. And this change text will look for the element name and the element ship and change the inner HTML with normal assignment. So the text is, as we can see here, Bosk meaning devours his prey in Dutch, blah, 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 and his ship, hound's tooth. And then we have this button where we on-click go to change text. So this is the text before pressing the button, and then we press the button. I do that, nothing happens. However, this should pop up. So change it to BS instead of Bosk. And instead of piloting the hound's tooth, I'm driving a Volvo. Yeah, that's actually much better to get to work. Actually, I ride the bike to work, so. Okay, we can't talk about JavaScript without mentioning Ajax. What we've looked at up until now is, first off, JavaScript as is, as a general purpose programming language, and then with the DOM model. And then thirdly, we need to look at Ajax, because Ajax was a fairly revolutionizing way of of using the web. AJAX is short for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and it makes it possible for us to update just a single part of the web application instead of updating the entire page. And this is done by having a object called XML HTTP request, which does just this. It fetches data and it puts it somewhere on the screen without updating all the other things. And AJAX has been one of the main reasons, I'd say, for making what's perhaps called the Web 2.0, namely that all our web applications today work more or less like desktop applications. Before AJAX, we had, as I said, to reload the entire page in order to make an update. With AJAX, we don't do that, and it's been out since 98, 99, and it's actually a Microsoft thing from the beginning, but it is now standardized. We will see later on that even though AJAX is a great way of doing this, things like Angular doesn't really use that much AJAX because it has another approach to how to create a web page. However, much of the web is still using AJAX, and it's possible, of course, to use AJAX together with Angular as well. It was popularized by Google and this search, suggest, and all of that. Mainly, we use AJAX through one or several libraries because it's fairly complex to set up and get to work manually. But I will show you a short example of how we could do that, and then we will not do that. In this case, we have the XML HTTP request object. It has 6 methods and 7 properties, and we are going to use a few of them in order to make a partial request. So we have abort, get all response headers, and so on. But more importantly, open and send and get requests somewhere. I think something has. Open and send are 2 of the most important parts. And the properties then are on ready state change, and this ready state is 0 for not initialized, 1 for open, and so on, making it possible. We need all of these states because we need to wait for the entire fetch to be made, for everything to be loaded before we can start popping up things. And it's also the case that we might want to listen for other things during this time. Response text or XML or body, whatever we like to get, really. Response XML was the general idea to begin with, but we can get just text or a binary encoded string instead. Status and status text and so on. It's easier to show an example, though this example is far from simple in itself. And that's, again, the idea of not having to do this by hand. The example, I call it first example, but I won't follow this up in this lecture. But the example will get a simple text file from the server and place it inside of a div tag without everything flickering. I can't show that in a static presentation, but you'll have to take my word for it. We have very little JavaScript need for doing this. It's a rather brute force, but it shows the basic workings of AJAX. It will look something like this. Who is both a Jedi Master and an ace pilot? And we do not show the answer because it will be placed over here. but when we press the button, it doesn't say that. This text over here this text will be replaced with this, which is fetched from the web server and placed in the div tag that's over here. And in order to do that, we will work our way backwards, I think. So what we do is we have some HTML, poorly formatted at that, but we have some HTML. It has a form input here. First off, we have the question, and then we have a form with an input button. And this input button calls a getData method, which we'll look at in just a second. On click, it sends the URL to the resource, in this case data.txt, which will be the answer text. There will only be that text. But it will also send a target div, so where we are going to send this. And the target div is down here. So whatever's inside of that data.txt will be placed in this div tag. That's the general idea. The way to do that manually is something like this. We create a XML HTTP request object, set it to false. We check if we are going to use the Microsoft way or we are going to use the standardized way. The standardized way should work with everything by now. And then we have a function called getData, which takes the source and where to put it. And then we check if we have a request object like this. We get the element by ID and put that in obj. And then we start the partial update by calling open. We do a get request on the data source, or the URL that we send. And we create an onReadyStateChange function, or we put a function to it, assign a function to it. And as long as the ready state is 4 and the request status is 2, or rather when it is, so when it's fully loaded, the ready state is fully loaded, didn't sound very well. And 200, everything is okay. When that's done, we set the inner HTML of the object that we retrieved over here to the response text, and it updates. And that's everything that we need to do in order to make this partial update to this single div tag. But this example hides or just disregards a lot of important stuff, unfortunately. So problems with the Ajax is what's going to happen when we press the back key, for example. What happens if the connection is slow and I repeatedly press this button like this, and so on. All of that is better to look to use a framework, something like jQuery or whatever it might be, that has inbuilt support for Ajax, because they will hide the messy details of using Ajax, and makes it a lot easier for us to work with Ajax. But Ajax as a whole is a good thing. Okay, if we want to know more about JavaScript, where do we go? Well, again, W3 Schools and Mozilla is really good places to learn this. There's a modern JavaScript tutorial at that place, and we have the Java T-point, which I found fairly well. Look at all these font awesome stuff I know. YouTube, search Google, Stack Overflow is always your friend, and so on. There's quite a lot of information about JavaScript out there. As I said, we are not going to use it, but we will rather look at TypeScript, which is much better. But before we move on to that, I'd really like to say a few words about Dart. What's Dart, you say? Well, Dart is another another alternative to JavaScript. It is, just as a few of the other technologies that we're going to create, a programming language from Google. It was originally intended to be a complete replacement for JavaScript, and Google actually had a version of Chrome which used Dart as the script engine. However, they soon realized that that wouldn't work, so they built Dart as a complete general purpose programming language. And it is, may I say, one of the most beautiful languages out there. So when you have a little bit of spare time, yeah, you do. But when you do, whenever, I would really recommend that you look at Dart, because it's a beautiful language. It works very well together with many of the technologies that we're going to look at after this. There is, for example, a version of Angular called Angular Dart. There is a Firebase library available, and so on. Dart is also the language used by the framework Flutter, and Flutter is a multi, or rather platform-independent framework for developing apps for Android and iOS. And it does compile this to native, so it's not something that's just run. So you can basically do anything with Dart, and it's my belief that Flutter is the next big thing when it comes to app development as well. So you have nothing to lose in trying to learn and look at Dart. And as I said, it's so beautiful as well. So have a look at that. And the last 15 minutes, I'm going to introduce Angular, but we will go in more deeply into it in the next lecture and have all of the rest of the stuff that we have in this lecture. But I would like to introduce Angular before we go. So it's a JavaScript, TypeScript, Dart front-end framework developed by Google. And the latest version, which is 5, defaults to TypeScript. But as I said, it's possible to use Dart as well, and it's also possible to use JavaScript if you like. The idea is to have a bit more declarative programming than imperative for declaring the application itself. Important, really important for when you are checking this up, is that from version 2 on, so 2, 4, or 5, which are the current ones, so 2 was a complete rewrite of Angular. So Angular 1, or Angular JS, as it was popularly called by then, was JavaScript. However, and it was very popular, and there was really nothing that stopped them from continuing that. But they found a few things that they didn't like. So they decided to, with version 2, to make a complete rewrite. But so far, anything from 2 and onwards is backwards compatible in one way or another. You might need to tweak a few things, but basically, if you're looking for tutorials or you're looking for YouTube videos or whatever, see to that it uses Angular 2 or 4 or 5. Why not 3, you say? Well, there was no 3. That had to do with the internal versioning numbers of the things that are inside of Angular. The latest version is 5, and we will probably see version 6 not too far away into the future. But as I said, if you look at 2, 4, 5, you will probably get most of the important information. No, I didn't mention that. Okay. So, as I said, Angular today uses TypeScript instead of JavaScript, and that means that a few more things have been added. So basically, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript which adds sugar that makes programming a lot easier. So, for example, it has typing. It has a sound typing system. It has better object orientation. It has generics. It has mixins and stuff like that. So it has a lot of more things that make this look more like what we today would call a modern programming language. It is developed by Microsoft, but it's free and open source. And among others, this Danish guy, Anders Højsborg, or something like that, who also helped to do. I have no idea. I don't know any Danish. He also designed C#, and he designed Turbo Pascal before that. And he's a really great guy at creating programming languages. So he's made the best of a superset of JavaScript. And that means that any valid JavaScript program is also a valid TypeScript program. And that's perhaps the reason why Google, when defining Angular 2 and onwards, went with TypeScript instead of Dart, because Dart is not a superset of JavaScript, but rather a completely different language, which is even better than TypeScript. But there are enough changes to make people confused, and when Angular 2 came out, it was different enough already to try to make this move as well. It's one important aspect, as it has a sound type system and all of that, is that it scales a lot better. It's easier to find errors, it's easier to create large application and so on. Version 2.7 transpiles to JavaScript, and when we begin coding our Angular apps, you will see that with the development tools that we will download, it will be very easy actually to just save the file, and it will transpile automatically by the tools installed. So we don't need to do anything extra, just code along and save the stuff, and it works nicely. Angular, TypeScript, all of these are designed to work well with Node.js. Even though we will not use Node.js as such, we will use the package manager npm. So you need to install Node, you need to install npm. Other than that, we can see TypeScript as a better JavaScript than JavaScript was. And there are a bunch of tools that are really great for using when it comes to TypeScript. But I would wholeheartedly, even though I'm in no way a Microsoft fan, this Visual Studio Code is really great when it comes to creating TypeScript programs, and also Angular, as Angular is using TypeScript. In the beginning, when I really used Atom quite a lot, but it didn't really work that well with Angular and TypeScript, not as well as I wanted. So even I have changed to Visual Studio Code, as it has really great support. Other great tools that you could use is WebStorm from IntelliJ, and a bunch of other, of course. But I would really recommend you using Visual Studio Code. Here's just an example, and as you can see, it's very much like the latest ECMA standard when it comes to object orientation. Defining a class with a attribute, full name, :string. We change the way that we define variables. So name of the variable first, and then colon and the type. And we have a constructor where we can use the publicly available parts, or we can define publicly available parts, and we can say that the full name should be these difficult parts, different parts. And we have an interface, and we have a greeter, and we can create a new student like this and just show it. I've just copied and pasted this. But you will see a lot of TypeScript code when it comes to Angular. I will really leave you there. I will just say one more thing, the first one over here. The idea with Angular is that we are going to create single-page applications. And here the idea is that instead of making loads of requests to the web server when we need to update all the things, we create a finished application as one single page, which is downloaded once, and then only the different parts that really need to communicate to the web server again will do that. But this means that we will have a initial fairly large download to the client, but after that the client handles a lot of the things that's going on. So it's heavily depending on the client, which is possible today, and it leaves the server for more computational heavy things like the database or whatever it might be. But loads of stuff is on the client side instead, and that's something that will be seen when we update and manipulate everything using the DOM and not as I say in the lecture notes right now, Ajax, but rather by manipulating the DOM tree, we create changes to the web page. But much more on this in the next and last lecture on web technologies. So thank you very much for today, and see you next time.